Hey everybody, I'm Maggie Vespa. Welcome to The Story. Dan will be back on Monday. In the meantime, though, in case you're unfamiliar with how things work here on The Story, this is the show where you talk to us and we talk back. Or we use your feedback as jumping off points to continue our coverage. Big example of that coming up in a minute. But in the meantime, this is a long-winded way of saying we really value your input. So email thestory@kgw.com, message us. You can message me or Dan on Facebook. You can tweet with the hashtag HeyDan. Our team is literally watching all of it right now, waiting to hear from you. Because as this moment in history is drilling into us like never before, listening to and seeking out and lifting up voices and perspectives that are different than your own is invaluable. We truly believe that here. And to that end, throughout the show tonight, you're going to hear sound from a wide variety of perspectives. Namely, as we go into each commercial break, you'll hear sound bites from protesters who took the stage last night and spoke from the heart to a crowd of thousands. And we just want to make sure those moments get their due. So all that in mind, let's start the show. And over the last couple of days, protests in Portland have followed kind of a pattern. It starts with a massive group, thousands upon thousands, walking across a bridge, gathering downtown, and making a powerful statement against police brutality and racism. All this in the wake, of course, of George Floyd's death. After often 4 or 5 hours of that, a smaller group splinters off sometimes and clashes with Portland police. And that's when our crews capture video like this. Clouds of tear gas launched by police at protesters. And now I want to point out, I'm using that term somewhat generically because yesterday the deputy chief of Portland Police said technically it's not tear gas, it's CS gas, which he said is actually more of a powder. And he made that distinction because, as viewers pointed out, the use of tear gas is banned in international warfare. And in fact, an update tonight, Seattle today suspended their use of tear gas for 30 days. And we just learned a few minutes ago that protesters are suing the city of Portland, seeking a ban on the tear gas or the CS gas or whatever it is here too. So this is a rapidly evolving story. Now, last night we played a soundbite from the deputy chief parsing out that difference between tear gas and CS gas, and we immediately got a ton of questions from you, our viewers, one of which I read on the air toward the end of the show. So here it is again. I want to show it to you again. It came from Scott Yin. He tweeted, if tear gas is banned, and then they said they're using CS gas, so basically branding a new name to make it okay to use on protesters? That was his question. And that really summed up the bulk of our feedback on this topic. So true to form here on The Story, I promised Scott and everyone else watching that we would keep pushing and keep digging, which we did, and you'll see evidence of that in a minute. But first, before we could even bring those questions to our leaders, something came straight up out of left field on this topic, and that was a news release from OHSU. The hospital, which is, according to their website, Portland's largest employer, tied this police tactic back to the COVID-19 pandemic, saying there is, quote, great concern among medical professionals about the use of tear gas and other chemical means, adding, quote, the use of tear gas could significantly exacerbate the spread. And keep in mind, they're talking about a virus that attacks a person's lungs. All right, so with your questions and with that statement in mind, we turn now to the city's press conference today. Officials have been holding these daily with the mayor and the police chief, or sometimes the deputy chief, taking our questions. So here again today is Deputy Chief Chris Davis with the Portland Police Bureau explaining why the Bureau argues CS gas, which again he described as more of a powder yesterday, is less toxic.
We're pushing the limits of my technical understanding of all of the details of each of these tools and how they work, but there are different kinds of irritants or tear gas or whatever you want to call it. If you walk out of it, you really stop feeling the effects almost right away, and you'll have some residual effects that at least I've encountered all the times I've been exposed to it, where I might get a little bit of an aftertaste, but you're functional a lot faster and you suffer a lot less long.
All right, so again, that's pretty akin to what we heard yesterday, but it didn't address viewers' concerns about the impact the gas has on a human's lungs as they do breathe it in, and it definitely doesn't address OHSU's statement tied to the pandemic. And really quick, a little background on these press conferences. It's clearly not safe to put every reporter from every news outlet who wants to be there in the same room. So we're often texting our questions to the mayor's reps to get them asked and then answered. And one of our executive producers texted asking if the mayor/police commissioner can explain his take on the difference between CS and tear gas and respond to OHSU's statement. At first, she was told no. The mayor's spokesperson texted back saying the mayor would just defer to police, especially if he's basically standing at a podium during a press conference. But that wasn't good enough, so we kept pressing. Our executive producer, Mila Mimica, pointed out the mayor's role as police commissioner and texted, and I quote, "He has a stake in this as well." Minutes later, her question was asked, and the mayor did not defer to police as predicted. Instead, he said this.
I stand with those who say that we should ban the use of tear gas, but with an important provision, and it's one that we have to talk about, which is I would support the discontinuation of tear gas or CS gas or whatever you want to call it, provided that there are viable alternatives for dispersal that do not involve higher uses of force.
All right, so that was a big statement from the mayor, the first of its kind from the mayor, and we do appreciate his staff finally asking the question. We'll let you know if anything tangible comes from that statement. And to that end, the mayor told us to expect a list of police reforms next week aimed at overcoming systemic racism and patterns of police violence against people of color. And we will, of course, be watching. In the meantime, we do want to focus on one reform that has already come about. Yesterday, Mayor Wheeler and Portland Public Schools announced they are pulling student resource officers, aka armed members of the police force, out of Portland's schools. And that is tonight's big story. The moment Mayor Wheeler made that announcement about SROs, we got a lot of different feedback on that topic too. And now districts outside Portland are also having conversations about how they want to move forward, trying to balance safety and the fight against systemic racism. Christine Pitawanich talked to two people of color about this, an SRO and the first person of color to chair the David Douglas School Board.
The news that schools in Portland will no longer have school resource officers, or SROs, on campus hit Officer Rick Puente hard.
It's a little disappointing.
For 16 years, he's been involved in school safety. He says the role of an SRO encompasses communication and relationship building, with very little emphasis on enforcement.
I mean, I could spend hours to tell you about life-saving stories of young people that I've encountered in my role as school resource officer in years past.
He says he hears the outcry from people of color and others who are bringing attention to systemic racism.
My heart is broken. I have shed tears for what has happened in this country. We need change, without a doubt, and I will push for that. But I don't want us to lose out on the end of school safety.
And we've heard from you, so many people worried about things like school shootings and other emergencies, and what it'll mean if an SRO isn't on campus.
The responses will still be there, just maybe not as immediate.
Over in the David Douglas School District, Andrea Valderrama serves as the school board chair, the first person of color to serve on the board, representing a district where the majority of students are people of color.
It's so important for me to say that unequivocally Black Lives Matter.
Schools in her district, because they're located in Portland, will also be without SROs.
I will say that, the action is long overdue. I think what I'm hearing from my students, from my staff, and from my community out here in David Douglas is that police officers do not contribute to an environment of safety.
Now she's bringing an idea to the next board meeting that would completely cut ties with police.
It's not just ending the SRO program or contract, but also extending that to any other contracts that we may have with general police officers at events.
Events like football or basketball games. But she's also heard from parents worried about the potential for decreased safety at school and events.
That is exactly why I'm asking for the resources to be reinvested in some of these upstream restorative justice and other necessary practices and policies so that we can have alternative responses, alternative staff there to address safety concerns as they arise.
Meantime, Officer Puente says he wants to address the fears that are out there and wants to keep lines of communication open with all communities of color.
We definitely do need change, and we're not hesitant to make change, but we also need the support of our communities to help us do that.
Christine Pitawanich, KGW News.
So one perspective we have not heard yet on the story are police officers who are also black. And it just so happens the president of the Portland Police Association, the union that represents officers, falls into that category. And while interviewing him yesterday about these protests and the tactics, our Pat Doris asked him basically if that's difficult.
I think it is anywhere in the country. It has been for years, and especially right now, because you're torn between an honorable profession that you believe in, but also you're faced with the realities, and not just in policing, but the socioeconomical system in this country is culturally biased and has been for years in education and job opportunities and housing opportunities. And these are things that lead to some of the things we see in law enforcement. We're the last rung in the ladder. When all else has failed for a lot of people, they end up in the criminal justice system, and not always rightfully so.
So the Portland Police Association represents about 850 rank and file officers along with sergeants and detectives. It also represents officers when they get into trouble, and the contract between the union and the city expires at the end of this month, and negotiations have actually stalled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But Mayor Wheeler said one of the main issues is accountability.
To root out a problem, it helps to understand it. And the thing with racism in Oregon is that the roots run as deep as our state's history. And when the story continues,
I don't want to shield them from that word.
How you can start having these tough conversations with the next generation.
They need to know that people are treated different based on the color of their skin, and that's not okay.
There's no end date for this. So keep coming, keep showing up, bring your energy, and remember that this is all for a purpose. And it demands all of your energy, every bit, every mustard seed of your energy. Bring it every night. Don't leave an ounce of it behind.
Hey everybody, welcome back. So I'm Maggie Vespa in for Dan, who, by the way, will be back on Monday for all of you Dan fans out there, or Dan stans if you're into that sort of thing, which by the way is stalker fan. Let's move on though. I said at the top of the show that this is a show about a conversation with you, and we have the hashtag #HeyDan, whether he's here or not, to get your thoughts and honestly to get ideas, and that has never been more vital. So I want to show you one now. We have a lot more coverage about this uprising against racism around the world, and we think viewer Mary Clausen made a great point in this email. She wrote, concerned basically that we have too many viewers who, quote, are not aware of Portland's history with policing actions that led to the deaths of black citizens. It is a great point, Mary, and it's important to remember that the protests that we're seeing in big cities and small towns across America and around the world are about so much more than the killing of one unarmed black man. They're about calling out the disproportionate focus that black men and black people and people of color more generally receive from law enforcement, a focus informed by centuries of racism and violence. Take, for example, this case in Tacoma, Washington, now getting national attention after the death of 33-year-old Manuel Ellis, which was ruled a homicide this week. Again, that happened this week. Ellis died in police custody back in March. The Pierce County Sheriff's Department's version of the story is that Ellis banged on the window of a passing car and assaulted an officer. Later, cell phone video showed Tacoma police officers beating him and restraining him, and that was shortly before he died in handcuffs. The medical examiner ruled that his death was due to a lack of oxygen due to physical restraint. And now Ellis's family wants the 4 police officers who were involved to be fired and arrested, just like the 4 officers now charged in the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Ellis's story has haunting parallels to Floyd's, down to some of his last words over the police scanner, saying, "I can't breathe." Last night, at a vigil, Ellis's mother said she'll remember a different set of last words, the last ones he ever said to her.
"I love you, Mom. I love you, Mom. And I can't hear that ever again. I won't be able to hear that."
So the officers involved had returned to duty until the homicide ruling. Now they're back on administrative leave. And to viewer Mary's point, if we open up the KGW vault, we can find similar stories closer to home. For example, in 1985, a black man named Lloyd Stevenson was killed in Portland police custody. An officer used a type of chokehold called a sleeper hold to detain him. Police say he was arguing with someone in a parking lot and they were trying to subdue him, and he died. Like today, this led to protests and extreme outrage, and Portland police, as a result, banned the sleeper hold. One thing is different in this case. A grand jury decided not to charge the officers involved. But I'm sure if you've lived in Oregon for a while, you probably have an idea that our state's history is literally rooted in racism. Before it became a state, the government of Oregon Territory passed what were called black exclusion laws. Black people were not allowed to settle in the territory or own any property. Those laws became part of the state's constitution when Oregon became a state in 1859. Voters eventually repealed those laws in 1926, 67 years later. By then, the Ku Klux Klan was booming in Oregon. Oregon actually had the largest KKK membership per capita in the entire country, and they helped to get racist politicians elected, including Governor Walter M. Pierce in 1922. And like a lot of cities across the country, Portland was also no stranger to redlining. Banks denied mortgages to people of color in certain areas, creating segregated neighborhoods. This map shows how Portland was divided in 1940. The red areas were labeled hazardous because of, quote, undesirable populations. The federal government banned this practice in the 1970s after the civil rights movement, but the effects of it are still doing resounding harm to this day. And these are all conversations that we need to have, especially white people and white parents with their children, even if it's uncomfortable. But needing to have that conversation is in and of itself a privilege, because people of color aren't afforded the luxury of being shielded from the impacts of racism. And this is a book that has helped some parents. The title pretty much says it all. It's called A Kid's Book About Racism. The author, Jelani Memory, wrote it for his own children 2 brown kids and 4 white kids. He says he understands that some parents want to just tell their kids that everyone is equal and we should respect each other. But he says that sentiment alone can actually backfire if you don't discuss racism.
The danger is that you end up teaching your kids that everybody has the same experience. And the reality is for Black individuals in this country, the experience is not the same as white individuals, just like it's not the same for women or women of color as it is for men. Start it and see what happens. And don't try and get everything right, because you won't get everything right. And as you find your kid is thoughtful and interested and curious, you can start to pull in some of your own experiences or experiences of friends, but also point to things happening on the news.
So, of course, there are a ton of resources out there for parents. We started a list of them at kgw.com. And actually, here's one of them that we think is worth your time. Sesame Street and CNN are holding a town hall called Coming Together, Standing Up to Racism. The show will talk to kids about racism, about the ongoing protests, and how they can help make a change. And they'll answer questions submitted by families. It's airing tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Pacific time on CNN. So recognizing the problem is step 1. Having those tough conversations is step 2. Step 3 is actually doing something about it. And local civic leaders have offered some great ideas. For example, we mentioned the city's contract negotiations with the Portland Police Association. So if you feel strongly about that, leaders say now is the time to contact the mayor's office with the changes you want to see. Civic leaders also point to the issue specifically of body cameras. Right now, Portland police don't wear them, and because of our pandemic budget crisis, they might not anytime soon. But a call to your commissioner, or again, the mayor's office, can put the issue back on top of the pile. And by the way, all city commissioners in Portland are at large, so you can call any one of them. Several leaders have also reminded people you don't need to be Black to join the NAACP or the Urban League or comparable groups. You just have to support equality for all Black people. They accept everyone. And something we've started hearing at a lot of the protests from civic leaders, from protesters, from local teachers, as you'll see, and so on, is that it's incumbent upon all of us to shift our collective behavior, shift it past not just not being racist, shift it instead to being loudly, adamantly, unwaveringly anti-racist. And we thought that term was best summed up by one of the teachers that Kristen Severance has been profiling in our year-long series, Inside Woodlawn.
I talked to you on the side about the idea of someone that's not racist versus someone that's an anti-racist. In this day and age, someone that's not racist isn't going to cut it. That's not going to be the status quo anymore. You either have to choose a side because you're being complacent and not doing something. Even though you may not agree with the tenets of racism, you still have an obligation when you see things happening to step up and say something. And that goes for all people. And so I'm at the point that, again, we can't stay by or stand by idly without saying something. It's all of our obligation at this point to step up and say things that are injustices across the board.
So that was just one powerful moment from Kristen's talk with the teachers at Woodlawn Elementary. The whole piece is up right now, along with our entire series, Inside Woodlawn, on our YouTube page. And I'm sure a lot of you have a lot to say about today's show and really the entire week plus past. So get out your phone and get ready to tweet with the hashtag #HeyDan. Do it now. You don't have to wait. You can also email the story at kgw.com. We are listening now and always, and we're finishing the story next.
White people that aren't at these protests, that are allies, that do the legwork, that have my back when I'm not around, that call people out on their bull. So yes, you're here, but that's not a pass to go back to your bull once this is done. I expect better out of all of you. Thank you for being here.
All right, guys, let's dig through the comments on this Friday. Jeremy tweeting, #HeyDan. The deputy chief said the questions are pushing the limits of his understanding about the chemicals used in crowd control. He's talking about the CS gas the Bureau says they use. If they don't fully understand it, why are they using it? We don't let people do surgery without an understanding of the anatomy. Why are police that way? So it's entirely plausible that just in that moment he didn't have the science in front of him or off the top of his head. That said, I think we can all bet, based on what we're seeing from the mayor's office and from the Bureau, that they are getting to understand it a whole lot more in the moment. We'll let you know what, if anything, changes as a result of these conversations. Thank you for tweeting. Colin tweeted, as a teacher, I love having our SRO in my class. The kids have loved it. The SRO makes a big positive impact on my students. I'm not sure which district you work in. That's an awesome thing to hear. At the same time, the Portland Public School District basically said, in this environment, the positives have ceased to outweigh the negatives, and they are pulling them. So keep talking about these issues. They're obviously complex, so many different perspectives, and we really appreciate everybody's input all week, especially. It's been so valuable. For now, though, that is it here on The Story. Have a great night.